Hey, what's up, everybody? I have a really special guest today, and we are talking about a super important topic in domestic abuse and domestic violence. This is Autumn Baker. She's from the Almost Oblivious podcast, and she is coming here to talk about some of her expertise and some of her experience regarding domestic abuse, some of the red flags that we should watch out for, what we can do to get help or to support other people who might be dealing with this problem. So, Autumn, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on. Like I said, you're the first one to bring us on from our podcast.
And that's super exciting. Definitely check out her podcast. It's called Almost Oblivious, and it's on a whole bunch of different platforms, if I remember right.
Yep, it's on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, Amazon Music.
Okay, great. Yeah. So first, what's the story behind the podcast, and I'll explain the story behind the name of the podcast too.
So Almost Oblivious is about breaking the silence on domestic violence and helping teach our listeners some not so subtle signs of abuse. I was a survivor, am a survivor, and I used to be a court domestic violence victim advocate. Yes, and so in that field, there was no community for survivors, and I recognized it. And with the name of the podcast, it's kind of a reflection on my experience and others' experiences. Basically, when you're in that situation, you are almost oblivious to the patterns of abuse until it's very undeniably like in your face. The podcast is about shedding the light on domestic violence and bringing about education, hope, and resources to those who need to hear it.
And so I want to be sure I'm using terminology correctly. Is, we talk about domestic abuse, domestic violence. Like, what's the difference? Is there a difference between the two? And maybe what other terms should we know before we dive into this conversation?
Yeah, so domestic abuse and domestic violence, they're interchangeable. You can use them the same way. I, a lot of times, will say domestic violence situation. Or just the situation, just because a lot of times people get very nervous and scared to talk about it. It's very, there's a huge stigma that you shouldn't talk about domestic violence. So I try to make it as easygoing and as casual as possible.
Got it. And so you've talked on your podcast about red flags for domestic abuse, domestic violence. What are some things that people can be watching out for, whether they're in a relationship already that they may suspect, or maybe somebody's telling them that there's a problem, or if they're considering getting into a serious relationship with somebody?
Yeah, so let's start with getting into the relationships at the beginning. A big thing you would recognize is rapid relationship progression, which is like love bombing and just jumping into a commitment really fast. So like after 2 weeks, they're like, I love you, or just they move in with you after a month. Stuff like that happens, but it feels like a fairy tale. It's very much like, the love movies and everything. So that's kind of the beginning. After that, you want to start listening if they disrespect your boundaries, along with if they're negatively talking about prior partners, and you recognize that they're not taking responsibility for their own actions in that. It's just, this person was bad, I don't like them, they did this, this, and this, but nothing's bad about themselves. After that, if you're in the relationship, you would start recognizing control. They're very controlling. They want to know who you're talking to, where you've been, what you're doing, where you spend your money, just super controlling. And another one is isolation. Abusers very much will separate the victim from friends and family. A lot of times not letting them talk to them, or they'll use their own words against them to make the victim less likely to speak to a friend or family member.
And so that's what you were talking about when you said there's very little community for survivors or victims of domestic abuse and violence. Part of the pattern is being isolated from loved ones and friends who would otherwise be that community or support.
It's a huge thing for abusers to make sure that the victim is alone. And the only one who can validate their feelings is the abuser.
Creating that cycle of dependency on them.
Exactly.
So then you talked about the love bombing, which I think for a lot of people would be really hard to identify as a red flag early on, because like you said, it feels so good. It feels so magical. But then I think what I noticed is that as you talk about later on in the relationship, the disrespect for boundaries, that could be another side of the love bombing, because they don't care how ready you are for any of that.
Yeah, exactly. And a big part of the love bombing is, let's say the abuser does something wrong. They're aggressive, yelling, mean, or anything. And the victim finds out like they did something wrong, they're really hurt, they're about to leave. And you'll hear, oh, no, I'm so sorry. I want to change. I love you. And then suddenly they're showering them with gifts. They're paying more attention to them. They're doing everything they did in the beginning when you started dating. It's that original persona they've put on. But then that only lasts maybe a few weeks, or it can even last a couple months. But yeah.
But like you recapture the magic for a little bit. Oh, wow.
Yeah. The big thing is to note that in a relationship like this, the abuser was never the real person you fell in love with to begin with. It was all just kind of a plot to get you hooked onto him.
I see. And depending on how much you can share of your own experience, if you had gone through that similar pattern, if you had experienced some of those things like the love bombing, the disrespect, at what point would you have been willing and able to recognize that if someone had pointed it out to you?
So I didn't, and I was in it for years actually as a survivor. And you get stuck. It's almost like brainwashing, and it makes you addicted to the abuser, which really stinks, but you get stuck. And the only reason I got out is I became educated in it. I started seeing the patterns and learning about love bombing, gaslighting, and everything. And so as I started to learn, I started to recognize it as he would do it. And so I'm like, well, this isn't real. And it started helping me prepare myself to get out of the situation.
Gotcha. And so as you talk about being trapped, I've worked with some clients who I feel like are in kind of that situation. I've never been in their homes, never seen their spouses, but from what I hear, I suspect. And a lot of their concerns with either leaving or breaking up with them is that maybe the spouse is the financial breadwinner. They feel like they can't go and have a living without them, or there are kids involved in the situation and they're scared of what might happen to the kids if they were to divorce or leave the relationship. What would you say to people who feel stuck or trapped in that kind of situation where it feels like there's some very tangible bonds keeping them to that relationship?
Yeah, that is one of the biggest questions I get asked, especially when I was working in the court system as a domestic abuse victim advocate. Well, first, you are not alone at all. So please, please, please do not ever think you're alone. This is so common. Last time I checked the statistics, it was 1 in 7 men and 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic abuse.
That's a lot.
It's just there's that stigma, you don't talk about it. But you are not alone. And then second, I would say start with a safety plan, which safety plans, you can find them online. We plan to put one on our website that's actually already built. It basically has all the questions and you just fill out the answers. But it's like, who can you talk to and confide to? Where can you keep little bits of money to start like building up a way to get out? But also research domestic violence shelters along with domestic violence victim advocates. Both of those can provide resources for getting financial independence, along with helping with protective orders, housing, and even legal aid. So I definitely recommend reaching out to them. Secondly, concerning children, because I know that is a huge one. A lot of people don't want to leave because it's like, oh, that's their mother or father, which is understandable. However, it has been proven, like children of domestic abuse, if they're witnessing that later on in adulthood, they could fall into the same cycle of being in an abusive relationship. And so children really shouldn't be around the physical or emotional abuse. Neither should you if you're suffering. You deserve a safe environment to be in. And they're not alone. But taking that first step is really, really hard. But it is definitely worth it in the long run. And there are organizations that can help you.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful to know that there are steps that someone can take even if they feel like they're all alone and they have nobody to go to or nobody to get help from. Looking backwards a little bit, I think a lot of the maybe justification that people may make for staying in these relationships is that, it was just a mistake, or like this person needs to, they're working on improving themselves. And so at what point does that get labeled as an abusive relationship versus that, they just had some more work to do? Like, how do we split the difference there?
So like when a survivor is constantly giving excuses for the abuser's behavior.
Yeah.
Because I definitely am a victim of doing that a lot, because it's like they're stuck in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's manipulation. And so people on the outside, as they watch, it becomes abuse when you keep seeing that the actions just continue, the behavior continues, and there's no change.
I see.
And that's when you start noticing it is abuse, it's manipulation. And if you're in the situation, manipulation is behavior doing the same thing over and over without any change in it at all. So if you keep fighting about the same thing over and over again, and they're just like, oh yeah, I'll do it next time, I'll be better. They're not going to after a while. And like friends and family on the outside, when they see that, it's hard on them.
Yeah.
Like my best friend had to go through it with me, and it got to a point like she couldn't tell me to leave. Like when you tell the survivor to leave, most times they won't, just because.
I imagine.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot. They're not going to leave, and that's a big thing as I preach, is that they have to leave on their own. They have to come to the realization of the situation they're in to be able to leave, and they're going to have to learn how to recognize the patterns to be able to get out.
Okay. And then so for the friends and family members of maybe those that they see in an abusive situation, if you're saying that, like, a lot of times you can't convince them to leave. What's the most helpful thing that somebody can do if you're on the outside of the situation looking in to support that person?
Yeah, just being supportive, honestly. If you just tell them to leave, definitely they're not going to. They'll just be like, oh, you don't like my partner I'm with.
Sure.
That's how they'll take it sometimes, because only they can have themselves leave. But just being supportive and being educated on the situation. Because it's even good for the friends and family to know what love bombing is, gaslighting and stuff. Because like I said, the more you're educated, the more you can help the victim too. If you point out this behavior, the victim is always going to be listening. Even if you're telling them to leave and you think they're not, they are always listening. But you just want to show support that when that victim decides to leave, they can reach out to you and they can go to you about anything they need. So mainly being educated and also taking care of yourself. In one of my episodes, my best friend, who's my sister, talks about how she needed to go to therapy and stuff too, because it was tearing her apart to watch me go through it.
Yeah.
And so you want to take care of yourself, but you need to be supportive for the victim. Just letting them know once in a while you're there. If you ever want to talk, you can talk to me, and like talking to them with an open mind and not just critiquing, because a lot of times the victim will be just venting.
Yeah.
And if they feel like they have someone they can talk to and who's going to listen to them, it'll be easier for them in the long run.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. What has been most helpful for you in your journey after experiencing domestic abuse?
Well, it was a long process, and it is not easy. I still do get PTSD moments where it's like I can hear him saying stuff to me, which really stinks, but it's a long process. And the biggest thing is community. Having your friends and family is vital, and being able to heal and grow. They help me remind me of my self-worth, and they help me rebuild who I am today. And a big part of it is my faith. I always say that Almost Oblivious came from me because I come from a Christian faith, Christian background. I feel like God gave me the name because honestly, I was just kind of sitting there and it just hit me about Almost Oblivious. And so I can't take all the credit, but I did lean into faith a lot, and it helped. And along with physical exercise, I started biking like 20 miles a week. It's good for you to help get the anxiety out and get your emotions out. But after that, it was more self-care and therapy. My therapist did amazing stuff, and she had me write down in a journal everything that I thought of. And I have this journal still, but anything I was thinking of, I'd write down my day. If a song reminded me of something, I put it in there. Like facts about domestic abuse and how it affected your brain, I put in there. Everything I felt, I put in this journal. So I did that, but mainly, like I said, self-care. Just being able to recognize what triggered me and to the feelings I had, because I had reactive abuse, which means basically I still remembered stuff he would say to me and I would react to it. And I felt like I still had like a part of him, even though I wasn't, that I was a little bit more antsy and I get angry a little bit faster. And I had a lot of trust issues.
Yeah, understandably.
But I had to give myself grace and just start recognizing on stuff I did do wrong and how I could be better and improve and focus more on myself and my mental health. So self-care, therapy, and faith.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I know that you said like there's a lack of community, a lack of conversation around domestic abuse and domestic violence. So what are some misconceptions or assumptions that you've come across in your time doing the podcast, through your own experience through the legal system, that you think need to be talked about and corrected?
Like I've said prior, I hate when people tell victims to just leave. They can't just leave. And a big thing I had learned is when a victim leaves their long-term like abuser, their brain goes through the same withdrawals that a drug addict goes through getting off drugs. And no one thinks about that. And you always hear the stigma of them be like, oh, he or she's just going to go back. They always do. And that is like the biggest thing you hear.
And that makes sense within that context.
Exactly. And it's like not many people know that.
Yeah.
And honestly, when I found out, that helped me a lot, because it's like, oh, I don't want to be with him, but my brain is just craving being around it.
Wow.
And I wish people would stop saying stuff like that. Because a lot of times that does make people just want to go back. Like if you think I'm going to just go into this.
Yeah.
It's
like you don't believe in them yourself.
Exactly. And it's like they don't want to hear that. They want to have a more positive mindset, because like I said, the abusers made them alone. They've made them feel like they're alone, and the only one who can validate them is the abuser, which is a huge stigma. Like working in the courts, I would see the reports and I would call victims of domestic abuse. When I first would talk to them, they would be like, they want to get help, they want to get better, they want to get out of this relationship. Give them one night and they would talk to the abuser. The next day they call me, be like, drop the charges, I hate it. Like,
oh wow.
The abuser has them like wrapped around their finger. And a lot of people just don't realize that. They don't realize how it really messes someone up psychologically. And so the main thing is just don't tell people to just leave. Get educated yourself on the situation.
Yeah, that's super helpful to talk about. And again, thank you so much for coming on to share some of your own insights and your experience about this really tough topic to talk about. For all of you watching, please do check out her podcast, Almost Oblivious. If you want to learn more, definitely go to her website where she has a ton of resources. Autumn, thank you so much for joining us today. And for all of you watching, please do like and subscribe. That helps us to continue bringing in really knowledgeable, awesome guests like this and continuing to grow the channel. Thank you all so much for watching. See you all next time.